Hi there. I'm here to talk with Morgan about the problem of protecting high-risk users. As Alex said, my name is Eva Galperin. I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I am not a technologist. I'm a global policy analyst, which is a title that I've put together to sound as bland as possible when crossing borders into dangerous places. I work on EFF's international team, where I spend most of my time worrying about privacy and security for vulnerable populations, usually activists and journalists, the kind of people who piss off governments. To that end, I do trainings with activists and journalists, and I have helped write Surveillance Self-Defense, which is our privacy and security guide. And I work with this guy.
Hi, so I'm Morgan Marquis-Boire, and as Alex mentioned, I'm currently the Director of Security at First Look Media, which, among other things, does publish The Intercept. Bunch of troublemaking journalists that they are. I also publish research through the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, which is sort of a multidisciplinary think tank at the intersection of security, human rights, and sort of digital media. In addition to that, I advise a number of organizations about security, including sort of the Freedom of Press Foundation and Amnesty International.
And together, we've done a very large pile of work. What's particularly interesting about the work that we've done is that it's multidisciplinary. It involves a lot of people and organizations that normally don't talk to each other. So we have NGOs, we have activists on the ground, we have academics, and we have people in private security. I would like to think that I am Wonder Woman in this picture, but I'm probably the useless blue-haired girl who is half of the Wonder Twins, and we spend most of our time arguing over which one of us is Aquaman.
Right, so this type of collaboration started, close to 5 years ago during a sort of series of events which kind of captured the attention of the world, the so-called Arab Spring. In these sort of heady pre-ISIS days, we tracked a series of information operations that were occurring close to the beginning of the uprising in Syria, which, as many of you will know, still ongoing. About 8 months or so after the civil unrest began, the Syrian government, pro-state, pro-Assad actors, decided that it was a very good idea to start monitoring the activities of pro-democracy dissidents, foreign NGO workers, and other people whose interests weren't strictly aligned with the governing regime. And the way they did this was by implanting malware, spyware. Malware is so judgmental. Like, it's really just software, but implanting this type of thing on their machines. And they primarily used social media to do it. I mean, there's been sort of a lot of discussion about the role that social media played during the Arab Spring. Obviously, YouTube and Facebook were very critical. And so frequently this was delivered in the form of phishing attacks, but also via sort of Skype Messenger. And it was delivered to a variety of really high-profile figures. The man's face you see up there, his name is Bourhan Galioun, and he's a professor at the Sorbonne in Paris. However, at the time, he was also the head of the Syrian transnational opposition. So just one example, like he was compromised, and they used this to compromise his social media presences, and then sort of seed malware in an effort to sort of compromise his followers, so they could sort of keep track of groups with which they weren't entirely pleased. Now, not entirely pleased is something of a euphemism. As you'll be aware, the situation in Syria has been tumultuous, to say the least. There's been some very real-world negative effects for people that were compromised by these actors. One that sort of really sticks in my mind is a case of a man named Taimur Karim, who was kidnapped by the Syrian police. He was beaten, he was tortured. He said, "They broke my bones, I did not talk, but that did not matter, because my computer was arrested before I was." And they showed him these transcripts of his Skype conversations and his emails, which they had gathered from his computer using what I would describe as really not very advanced malware at all. Following on from this, we started writing these posts, as I said, close to about 5 years ago, and we wrote about 14 on the situation in Syria. And this led to us being contacted by other activists in the region. As you'll remember, the entire Middle East was in some disarray. And some of the most famous or well-known work to come out of this was on the now infamous malware product produced by the Italian company Hacking Team, known as Remote Control System.
So this is sort of the story of how the hacking team sweater became unraveled, where you find that sort of first thread. And I'm sitting around having done a whole bunch of work with Morgan, and I'm reading Slate, and I see an article which describes a situation in which an unnamed Moroccan activist had had his computer compromised by the Moroccan government. And I said, gee, that sounds interesting. So I call Morgan up and I say, you want to work on this? And he says, well, do you know any activists in Morocco? And as it happens, I knew one activist in all of Morocco. His name was Hisham Al-Marat, and I had just spent some time with him at a conference in Porto. So I call up the one activist that I know in all of Morocco, and I ask him, do you know who it is who has been compromised with this malware? And he says, well, you got it in one, because it's me. I had him go ahead and send the sample to Morgan, and Morgan and Citizen Lab wrote up a report, and this was really the first evidence that we saw of hacking teams' involvement in the compromising of activists in these sort of countries where the rule of law was not particularly strong. Now, this was not the end of things for these Moroccan activists, because it turns out that it was not just Hisham who had been compromised. For these Moroccan activists who were being surveilled by the Moroccan government, many of these activists were members of an organization called Manfakench, which Hisham helped to found, and which later fell apart because of pressure from the Moroccan government. And a lot of these guys are currently being they're on trial by the Moroccan government for a variety of sort of trumped up charges, ranging from adultery to, threatening the national security of the state.
Yeah, so, similarly, this man here, Ahmed Mansoor, he's an interesting character. He's currently an advisor to Human Rights Watch. He lives in the UAE, and he's one of the so-called UAE Five. These five individuals had the distinction of being imprisoned by the government for signing a pro-democracy petition. Not a particularly popular move. He was released. His opinions on the value of democracy had not changed. Unsurprisingly, his government's opinions on his opinions also unchanged. And so he found that the ramifications of this was that he was being followed and he was being beaten. He would actually have plainclothes thugs, and they would sort of assault him at university or on the street. And he was really unaware of how they were tracking his location. He's a sharp man, and he suspected that this was somehow done through his computer. And so he contacted me, and I performed forensics on his computer, and lo, I found that his hunches, his instincts were actually pretty good. He'd been sent a Word document, which he had opened, not believing that a Word document could actually do anything bad. I know, right?
It was 2012.
It was 2012, It was a different time, a simpler time. But yeah, he'd opened this Word document which contained an exploit which had then implanted hacking teams' malware onto his computer. Now, they say that attribution is tricky, that nebulous day, but sometimes it actually isn't, because we found that for a period, the command and control server for this malware actually pointed to a small IP address range which was owned by the Office of the Sheikh in Abu Dhabi. Which I found very difficult to figure out exactly who that was, but I have some suspicions. And so this type of activity, of course, wasn't confined to the Middle East, although it was a very interesting time to observe it, largely because the conflict meant that I think a lot of sort of surveillance operations went into high drive.
All right, so it's not just the Middle East. What we have here are two reasonably well-known bloggers in Vietnam. This is Le Quoc Quan and Du K. As part of my work at EFF, I actually have spent a lot of time sort of doing activism on their behalf. As sort of, pro-democracy, critical of the government bloggers in Vietnam, they have been harassed, beaten, and repeatedly jailed over the years. As it turns out, not only did this turn out to be a problem for the bloggers themselves, but it turned out that the work that people outside of Vietnam were doing on their behalf also garnered the notice of the Vietnamese government. About 2 years ago, in January of 2014, I found myself targeted by the Vietnamese government with malware that they sent directly to me, which makes gathering the samples super simple. Definitely appreciate. I was not the only person targeted at EFF. There were two of us. It was me and an activist, April Glazer. And we had been targeted with an email made to look as if it was coming from a gentleman at Oxfam offering to bring us to an Asia conference of some sort. This did show a very strong understanding of what motivates activists, but I think that if they had really wanted us to click on the link, they should have offered free flights and hotels. So having analyzed the sample, we discovered that this was actually part of a campaign going back to 2010, which Google first noticed. We also connected it to samples which were targeting a blogger in Los Angeles who had also written on these subjects, and a mathematics professor at the University of Toulouse. What was particularly interesting about this campaign was not that the Vietnamese government had chosen to target me, though of course I thought this was very important, but that they had chosen to target my coworker who had only been at EFF for a couple of months and whose entire contribution to sort of pro-Vietnamese blogger democracy campaigning was having written a single blog post that I had not had time to pen myself. So this leads us to the very worrying conclusion that all it takes is one blog post to get on the Vietnamese government's radar.
So, I'm going to talk a little bit about this campaign, which we call PackRat, which is, as you can tell from the map behind us, is focused mainly on South America. Speaking a little to the targeting of Eva and April by the Vietnamese government, at Citizen Lab we spent several months working on this campaign. Of course, that involves, while you're doing this, you run a lot of malware samples in a sandbox. Occasionally, you might run these on sandboxes live to the internet because you want to watch the traffic, you want to perhaps see what the attacker's behavior is like, stage 2s of the malware. In this case, these particular actors, maybe they're having a bad day, got very pissed off with this activity, and decided it was a very good idea to threaten a member of the Citizen Lab team, pointing out that they knew who we were, which I guess they really do now, but decided at the time that they would sort of point out they knew who we were and they knew where our families lived. And they were going to shoot us, them, everybody, which we sort of noted, moved on. And then, of course, they did it again about 2 weeks later. However, it's interesting, I guess if someone threatens to shoot you, you're kind of like, oh, well, that seems really bad. Having said this is quite easy to contextualize in the scheme of these things because, sitting in my house in San Francisco looking at malware, it's like, yeah, really? I grew up on the internet. People threaten me every day. Have you been on Twitter? But so this group had been active for we discovered, at least 7 years. They targeted judges, lawyers, members of the ruling political family in Argentina, journalists, NGOs. And they're very active, in some ways quite brazen, as you could tell from the threats. This woman, her name is Janet Hinostroza, and she was hacked twice in 2013. Her emails were leaked and then published by a news organization who claimed that they got her Gmail contents via FOIA request. FOIA request. I don't know if there's anyone from Google in the audience, maybe you can comment on that later. But however, they targeted a lot of journalists and quite pugnaciously. This woman, Marta Roldos, is an environmental activist and journalist from Ecuador, and we discovered that she had been targeted 34 different times over this period by this group. Obviously, her pro-environmental position is very unpopular. So, this is just sort of, these are just examples of, the types of individuals, organizations that we've worked with and the types of actors that we've seen operating in this area. Sort of between us and others at Citizen Lab, we've seen the targeting of activists and journalists on all 5 continents. Well, maybe not Antarctica. Have we? No?
There's still time.
There's time. But yes, as you'll notice, our primary interest group in terms of people being targeted by governments are sort of activists, journalists, and human researchers, and this is primarily because they don't have security teams, right? So there's a distinct asymmetry problem there. Now, it's important to note that when we say high-risk users, there's obviously a spectrum, right? How much, the spectrum that I've been using when we've been discussing this is on a scale of 0 to Edward Snowden, right? Do you have to hide in Russia? And so not all high-risk users are created equal, and not all are equally desirable to governments. Whoa.
Which brings us to the question of, so what is it that you guys are doing all day? Primarily, what we do, probably the thing that takes the most time, is outreach, community relations, and trust building, which is getting out on the ground and meeting that one guy in Morocco who's probably being targeted with malware. This takes a lot of time. Trust is not free. You have to build it up before somebody who is on the ground, who is possibly being threatened by their government, trusts you enough to give you full access to their computer. They better have spent some time with you in order to understand that you're trustworthy. We also do actual incident response, so forensics, malware analysis, and threat intelligence. This is sort of the meaty technical part of the job. We also do a lot of education. So the easiest way to deal with this sort of malware problem is to somehow convince your vulnerable population not to install it on their computers in the first place. As you can tell, most of these attacks are phishing and watering hole attacks. And with a little bit of education, you can actually do a lot to cut down on the effectiveness of these kinds of attacks. As has been frequently pointed out, the vast majority of the vulnerable populations that we see are not being targeted by spooky O-Day. They are almost never using brand new exploits. They're using old exploits for unpatched software, if they're even using exploits at all. And also, we do like a little bit of IT support and security help desk. So sitting down with somebody and trying to work out whether this is a state-sponsored actor or they just like clicked on some weird porn link. We also do a lot of policy research. The kind of work that we do often has very interesting legal ramifications. EFF is currently involved in a lawsuit in which we represent a gentleman living in Washington, D.C., who has been surveilled by the government of Ethiopia, who covertly installed Finfisher's surveillance malware on his computer and used it to spy on his Skype conversations and Google searches, which in the United States is a violation of the wiretapping statute. So we think that Ethiopia should pay. Finally, we'll pay. And finally, we do a lot of advocacy. We think that you're really not going to see any kind of policy change among companies or countries or even among NGOs unless people are aware of what a very serious and severe problem this is and what people can do about it. And last of all, we do follow-up, which is to say that when you are working with an activist or a human rights worker whose computer has been compromised, often the security researchers show up and they say, well, I have my sample, bye. And what the activists really want to know is it safe to use my computer again? Like, am I still being surveilled? What's up? And to this end, Morgan and I spent the last about year and a half to 2 years embarked on what we refer to as the We Could Be Heroes tour. We have given a number of talks, including I've given a keynote at Recon in Montreal and at OSCERT in Brisbane, in which we reached out to the security community and we said, this is the kind of work that we have been doing. You should come and do this work with us. This is an approach that has run into a few stumbling blocks.
Yeah, probably the one that is the easiest to articulate is that there's obviously a lot of moving parts to this. A lot of these are nebulous, non-time constrained, difficult to assign in the form of a ticket or a bug. The bit that's probably easiest to segment and compartmentalize is the malware analysis. And obviously, in some ways, that's the most satisfying because it actually means that you've done a whole bunch of this stuff first. I've had various colleagues helping out with this type of thing, and there's generally a lot of frustration at the sort of unbounded nature of doing this type of work. And so yeah, we actually found out that a lot of people wanted to help out, however, found that actually doing this type of work wasn't simply malware analysis, which is sort of what they signed up to do. Sorry, user interfaces are really hard. So, I mean, to that end, one of the reasons why we've actually been doing this work is that, as Alex pointed out, there's a lot of people at large companies that care a lot about this sort of thing. It's very difficult for them to do this type of work in depth, partially because it's non-time bounded, and secondly, there's frequently sort of a conflict with corporate interest. For instance, I mean, if, for instance, you have corporate interests with the Vietnamese government, then actively assisting people that they view as having an adversarial position to their authority may not work out well in a business sense. And so there's kind of a broad spectrum that large corporates generally use to try to protect all of their users. It's very difficult for them to really be seen to be focusing on protecting sort of small groups of at-risk people. There is an area of the security industry that is ostensibly very interested in this, which is obviously threat intelligence. And I mean, threat intelligence companies care, I mean, and again, for very similar reasons, about malware and not people. As Eva mentioned, Tibetan community is actually a great example. The Tibetan community is actually largely sick of the security community, because the security community is very, very interested in their targeting by the Chinese, almost completely disinterested in them and what their struggle is, which leads to sort of an uneasy relationship between the sort of threat intelligence industry and the populations that are targeted.
So let's talk a little bit about what is actually being done. The first thing is state-sponsored warnings. I believe Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, and Twitter have all either currently implemented warnings which tell users when they think they have been the victims of state-sponsored hacking, or have pledged that they will do so in the near future. And we think that this is a very good idea. Second of all, sort of ubiquity of two-factor authentication. As we've pointed out before, a lot of these attacks are phishing attacks, and they are attacks on password credentials, and you can do a lot to fix that simply by implementing two-factor on your service. And third, we've seen a sort of rise in ubiquitous encryption, which has been discussed in many of these other talks. So we have seen more and more companies going over to SSL by default for their services. We've seen a greater use and awareness of end-to-end encrypted communications, like Jabber with OTR or Signal, and we think that's great, but it's also an approach that has some limitations.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong, I'm pro-encryption before you bust out the pitchforks, but a lot of the security education narrative, is like, how can I protect myself from surveillance? Well, you should use PGP, Tor, and OTR, and that's great unless you're actually targeted, because it doesn't matter if you receive a link to a watering hole via a PGP encrypted email. It's still a link to a watering hole that you're opening in your vulnerable browser, so you're still compromised, the malware is still on your machine, and you're still screwed, despite the fact that you have followed laborious command line instructions in order to how to generate and use your PGP keys. And so this is actually a sort of a problem in how advice is given to targeted communities, and especially because a lot of people don't really know about computer security, and so they think that this advice is going to protect them. How could I possibly have been compromised by a state actor? I use OTR all the time. And it's this sort of combination of suggesting that people use secure messaging in order to protect themselves from mass surveillance, in order to protect themselves from targeted surveillance, which is really sort of problematic advice.
And even people that we consider to be experts in the field sometimes fall into the sort of trap of mischaracterizations of threats. This is a tweet from the Gruk, who is, I think, probably one of the most high-profile public thinkers about operational security for activists, journalists, and other people who piss off governments. And he says here, most vulnerable is not a very useful metric. If you aren't targeted, basic protections are sufficient. And in this area, we agree. But if you are targeted, none are. And in this area, I disagree very strongly. And that's primarily because the variety of work that Morgan and I have done has been on governments that have very different capabilities from, say, the Five Eyes or Israel or China or Russia.
Yeah, so people frequently threat model very poorly, right? Like what people are very worried about is what they hear about in the media, and there's been a lot of discussion about the capabilities of, primarily the NSA, also the Five Eyes, over the last couple of years, which means that, sort of people, when people worry about threats themselves, they actually worry about specific capabilities that, vastly resourced governments have. Whereas there's a lot of people that aren't being targeted specifically by the NSA at all. I would describe on a range, much like Zero to Snowden, on a range of Syria to the NSA, there's a lot of governments whose capabilities are not particularly impressive. And even the more capable governments actually field teams that operate at different levels of proficiency. Frequently, the types of teams that we see targeting journalists, activists, and human rights researchers, unsurprisingly, do not bust out zero-day and firmware implants because these people don't have security teams, so it's not necessary. Like, why tip your hand and show, advanced capability when you don't need to? Another thing that's worth keeping in mind is that even advanced actors will throw their nets, or sort of cast their nets broadly when it comes to targets that are desirable but not essential. Recently we saw the Russian government targeting stacks of journalists, and so you send out 2,000 reasonably nondescript phishing attempts. There is science to this, there is business, there is metrics, there is statistics. They may expect their return on this operation to be 0.5%, and that's actually okay.
So speaking of Russia, what is to be done? Obviously, this is a very hard problem. But we think that it's really important to at least try to solve it because the stakes are very high. We are talking about users who are potentially being imprisoned, tortured, killed, jailed, beaten up. And what we have here are some suggestions, and we're not under the weird delusion that this is going to solve everything, but we do think that this stuff is worth implementing. Let's talk first about what industry can do. We would really like to see the antivirus industry implement state-sponsored warnings. This is the industry with the most insight into attackers and the people who are being attacked. And I understand that activists in Vietnam or Syria or journalists in Argentina are not people with fat stacks of cash, and therefore they may not interest large corporations. But we think that these are the people who really are in a position to do something about it. The second thing we'd really like to see people do is when they issue their state-sponsored warnings, we'd like to see those state-sponsored warnings be useful. Twitter recently sent out a bunch of state-sponsored warnings which gave some kind of interesting advice. It ended with the advice that one of the ways in which to mitigate the harm was to connect to Twitter using Tor. Now, I'm not entirely sure what sort of attack is mitigated in this fashion, but I would really like to see these warnings give useful advice that is clearly linked to the attack. This is not like a big diss on Twitter. I would like to see them continue to send out state-sponsored warnings. State-sponsored warnings are a good idea. Just make sure they're also useful.
Yeah, and sort of on a more personal note, as a sort of a security researcher that spent a lot of time doing this, I think it is actually great for people to volunteer their security expertise to help people that can't afford to pay a $500 an hour consulting fee. There's some sort of, there were some hurdles that I've sort of experienced over the last few years of doing this. One that pained me personally was that, when you volunteer to do this, you may not be recognized as the rockstar security engineer that you are, largely because, people don't realize that your time is very valuable. People don't realize that what it is that you do. They're not going to realize how long it takes you, and they're probably not going to understand the output of your work, which is full of IDA screenshots and an explanation of this sort of rolling XOR function with multiple templates, which actually makes this really difficult to unpack, and I'm really smart for doing this. And they're like, that's okay. So what do I do now? Can I get access to my iCloud account again? Right? Like, I mean, and that's actually what you're going to have to come to terms with. And so, you know, your time will be wasted. It will not be appreciated. Not always, but sometimes. And so it really helps if you actually sort of select people help that you actually really care about. To this end, we recommend that you note I have not received any money from RightsCon. But
go to RightsCon. RightsCon Silicon Valley will be taking place March 30th through April 1st, 2016, here in beautiful San Francisco. If you're a security researcher who is interested in meeting NGOs and activists on the ground and you want to sort of, you know, give this all a try, this is a very good place to do it. This is also where Morgan and I hope to be giving a talk about the specific kind of operational security problems that NGOs have and what they could be doing in order to really up their game. Thank you very much.